Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Michael Byers on the topic of Arctic governance. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Every week on the program, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international affairs, or some other aspect of external relations. Today, my guest is Dr. Michael Byers. He is a Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law at the University of British Columbia. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Let's get right to it. Why is the Arctic so important right now in 2015?
Well, the Arctic is central to the greatest issue of our century, which is climate change.
Right.
Climate change is more advanced, more visible in the Arctic than anywhere else on Earth for a couple of reasons, one of which is that the Arctic exists in a precarious balance between the frozen and the unfrozen.
Right.
And so a change of just a few fractions of a degree can dramatically change the landscape. And in parts of the Arctic, like the Western Canadian Arctic, the average annual temperature has changed by as much as 4 or 5 degrees Celsius already. So
right.
Really dramatic changes. And then these changes in the Arctic have impacts on weather patterns on the climate elsewhere in the world. So we're seeing alterations in the jet stream, for instance, that scientists believe are connected to the larger expanse of open ocean in the Arctic and
right.
the absorption of solar energy into that new sort of sink, whereas previously the solar energy just bounced back off the ice sheet
right.
out into space. So dramatic changes in the Arctic because of climate change. And then, of course, relevant to the Arctic specifically, with those changes come improved accessibility, increased shipping,
right.
And all of that. But the overall change, the thing that makes the Arctic central in international affairs in the 21st century is climate change.
Right. And can you say a little bit about the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas and how that relates to Arctic governance?
Well, back in the early 1980s, Canada played a central role in the negotiation of the so-called Constitution of the Oceans. A
right.
Canadian lawyer and diplomat named Alan Beasley was the chair of the drafting committee at the UN conference on the law of the sea. And at certain critical junctures, he was in the room alone with the negotiators from the Soviet Union and the United States
right.
as they hashed out key provisions. And one of those provisions was Article 76. On extended continental shelves, the
right.
possibility that a coastal state could have sovereign rights over the seabed beyond its 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. And the Soviets and the Americans and Alan Beasley, the Canadian, knew that they were talking about the Central Arctic Ocean,
right.
which is a relatively shallow ocean that has several submarine features like the Lomonosov Ridge that extend well beyond 200 nautical miles. And they set in place a very detailed legal structure based upon science, based upon the shape and the sediments of the seabed, so that there would be no question as to who owned what, that there would be clear rules. And they did
right.
this during the Cold War, anticipating that this problem would come up at some point in the future.
Right.
And by setting out clear rules, they were planning to avoid tension, to avoid conflict through international law. It was brilliant. And now in the 21st century, right. this is now being put into operation. And we see some remarkable things, like, for instance, in December 2014, Denmark making a submission under this procedure to most of the Arctic Ocean, the entire Lomonosov Ridge, all the way across to the Russian exclusive economic zone. And the very next day, the Russian Foreign Ministry, this is at the height of the Ukraine
right.
crisis.
Right.
Height of the Ukraine crisis, Russian Foreign Ministry issues a press release, says, Denmark's following the rules, everything's totally fine.
Wow.
Right? Because of the foresight
yeah.
of those diplomats, including a Canadian, in the early 1980s. So it's a fabulous good news story.
Right. Well, maybe we can talk about the Ukraine crisis a
yes.
bit. I mean, that was one of obviously the big stories of 2014, and it put Russia at odds with Western countries. How has that conflict influenced or affected cooperation in the Arctic?
Well, again, some good news. The Ukraine crisis has not affected international cooperation in the Arctic very much. And let me give you another example. On December 1st, 2014, a South Korean fishing trawler, the Oryang 501, sank very close to the Russian coastline in the Bering Sea. Almost immediately, the Russians picked up the phone and called the U.S. Coast Guard. And the first assets on the scene were a U.S. Coast Guard C-130 Hercules and 2 U.S. Coast Guard cutters in Russian waters, saving lives.
Wow.
And Russia was able to make that call that quickly because of a multilateral search and rescue agreement that had been negotiated and concluded under the auspices of the Arctic Council in 2011. So it worked, and it continued to work. Height of the Ukraine crisis, right? Lives are at risk. Who are you going to call? Your opponents in the Ukraine crisis. Right. And we could talk about different explanations as to why this cooperation is continuing. One is that the Arctic is a very expensive and dangerous place, and so there's an incentive for countries to cooperate. Another is the fact that by cooperating in the Arctic through mechanisms like the Arctic Council, Russia gets an almost unchallenged leadership role in Arctic politics. I mean, the Arctic Council gives it strength. It's one of the members. It has effectively a veto, like it has in the UN Security Council. It has every incentive to keep that institution alive because it excludes other countries, non-Arctic countries. China is never going to be a member of the Arctic Council. It's an observer. India is never going to be a member. The European Union is never going to be a member. Russia is a dominant member, along with the United States. So the Arctic Council, Arctic cooperation, gives Russia influence.
And just building on that, who are the big players in Arctic governance, in addition to Russia and the US, and what are their interests in that part of the world?
Well, big players, the Arctic countries, obviously all 8 members of the Arctic Council, but there are some countries do punch more above their weight than others. Iceland, little Iceland, population 300,000, punches way above its weight. And we could talk about reasons for that. If you're small, you need to be imaginative about your diplomacy. You need to be nimble. You need to take advantage of opportunities. Norway's a big player. Denmark's a surprisingly big player. Canada, not nearly enough. I mean, it's remarkable how Canada has stepped back a bit, hasn't been ambitious about Arctic diplomacy, has tend to be a bit parochial and focus on issues that are of concern in Canada, while neglecting some of the international domain. And that's now changing because the United States is taking up the chairmanship of the Arctic Council and is very ambitious. Wants to see ecosystem-based management for the Arctic Ocean, and in parallel to the Arctic Council is working through the United Nations for a new annex on biodiversity protection in the Convention on the Law of the Sea. Some very serious ambitions to deal with short-lived climate forcers like black carbon. The United States really serious about climate change in a way that the Canadian government has not. But the thing that I would like people to remember is that for the Arctic countries, for Russia and for Canada, the Arctic Council and other mechanisms in the Arctic give us strength, and together we can manage this area, this region, without the complexities of having to seriously integrate the interests of non-Arctic states. And now that we have more and more observers at the Arctic Council, countries like China, the Council and our role is given greater legitimacy. I mean, an organization is only as powerful as the people in the room, and now we've got China sitting in the back row, legitimizing by its presence what we do.
So perhaps we could focus on Canada. What are our interests in the Arctic? And I think back to an early moment in Prime Minister Harper's mandate where he went to the north and he said, if you don't use it, you lose it. So what are Canadian interests in the Arctic and in the north?
Well, for many politicians, Mr. Harper included, the principal interest lies in domestic politics. And the use it or lose it rhetoric wasn't directed at the Russians or the Americans. It was directed at Southern Canadians. And he has made the Arctic part of his brand. Unfortunately, the statement was incorrect. I mean, the first thing was that the Indigenous peoples of the North said, what the heck is he talking about? We've been here for thousands of years. We're not going anywhere, Through that statement, he overlooked the important role of the Inuit and other indigenous peoples in Canada's north. And he has neglected them ever since and has been locked in a legal battle, for instance, with Nunavut Tungavut Incorporated, the land claims organization in Nunavut, over what they perceive as a serious failure to implement the land claims agreement. But the other reason that that statement was wrong is that, that the Canadian Arctic is not at threat from other countries. Countries, aren't about to conquer parts of Canada's Arctic. The countries that are sometimes put up as threats actually have equally strong interests in maintaining the rules. I mean, Russia, the largest country on Earth, has vast maritime zones, a vast exclusive economic zone, vast extended continental shelves that are its by virtue of international law. And it doesn't need to worry about protecting those interests militarily because other countries recognize that. So it's a reciprocal arrangement, right? China uses the same rules to support its claims in the East China Sea. South China Sea is different. South China Sea is about rocks and islands, but the East China Sea is about UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention, and the rights that exist within it. And so we have this package deal, and it works for everyone. The only disputes that exist in the Arctic, well, the only one over land is Hans Island, which is irrelevant. It's a place that we can go and plant a flag before an election campaign, but it involves a very, very close ally, Denmark. Right? And then the maritime disputes. In 2013, former Foreign Minister John Baird got together with his Danish counterpart and announced a provisional maritime boundary out to 200 nautical miles. That dispute's been solved, essentially, by that. The only other existing maritime boundary dispute in the entire Arctic is between Canada and the United States in the Beaufort Sea. Right. And we've been talking about that, and we'll reach a solution because, among other things, we're in a common energy market under Chapter 6 of NAFTA. That, this isn't about oil and gas and access to that, because we're in this common market. Everyone else has solved their maritime disputes. Russia and the United States solved their maritime boundary dispute in the Bering Sea and Chukchi Sea in 1990. Russia and Norway did theirs in 2010. It's all been sorted out under the law of the sea through negotiation. And so when Mr. Harper stands up and says use it or lose it, he's essentially misleading Canadians in terms of domestic politics by creating a threat where there really is none.
And perhaps just building on this, the current government has said they're going to purchase F-35 aircraft. Is there a connection between that military investment and Arctic sovereignty or Canadian claims in the north?
Well, the Canadian government would have Canadians think that we need F-35s to protect the Arctic, for instance, against Russian Tupolev bombers that enter Canadian airspace. Right. The fact of the matter is that the Tupolev bombers do not enter Canadian airspace. I remember back in 2010, there was a bomber that came into the Beaufort Sea, out to around 190 kilometers from shore in international airspace. And not only the defense minister at the time, Peter MacKay, but also the prime minister suggested publicly that the Russians had entered Canadian airspace. And the head of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, the four-star U.S. general, called a press conference to deny that that had happened and to compliment the Russians for having acted, quote, professionally. Because the fact of the matter is that there is an agreement between Russia and the United States whereby Russia gives advance notice of these flights in international airspace so that no one is surprised, right? NORAD knows in advance. They treat these as exercises. And Mr. Harper and his defense ministers have misled Canadians again on this. In terms of the F-35, the other thing about the F-35 is that it is supremely unsuited for Arctic missions because it only has one engine. Okay. Right? We chose the F-18, as did the U.S. Navy, because of its two engines and its ability to therefore operate in remote regions over the oceans with the backup of a second engine if one engine were to fail. So you get back to base. The pilot does not have to parachute onto the frozen tundra, right? And therefore be at risk, among other things, of polar bears, right? Serious risk if you're a pilot flying over the Arctic. Yep. And this is why the Navy is still purchasing F-18 Super Hornets, because it has the same mission. And Canada buying a single-engine jet, given that we are the second largest country on Earth with the longest coastline, is completely nonsensical. These planes are not being bought to defend the Canadian Arctic. They're being bought for missions in coalition operations overseas as first strike fighters. That's what they're called. And before anyone says, well, F-35 engines are extraordinarily reliable, the technology has advanced, I would just refer them to what happened in the summer of 2014, where an engine on an F-35 failed and the whole program was put back by 6 to 12 months because of problems that Pratt & Whitney was having with that single engine.
Right. Shifting gears slightly, the North or the Arctic has always held out this economic economic promise. And of course, one of the interests that Canada and other countries have is economic activity in the North. And with climate change, the possibilities seem to be even greater. One of the big stories, of course, in 2015 has been the drop in world oil prices. How, if at all, has that affected the prospects for economic development in the North?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly lower prices for oil mean that, among other things, high-cost projects are less likely to go forward. Right. And Canadian Arctic oil is exceedingly expensive because, among other things, our lack of infrastructure. Our most northerly port is in Manitoba, right? So, extracting oil from, say, the Queen Elizabeth Islands of northern Nunavut would be an exceedingly expensive project because of the lack of infrastructure, the lack of substantial local communities to provide workforces, the fact that you actually would have to build everything anew just to start a project. Similar challenges in the Beaufort Sea. It's different in other parts of the Arctic. The Norwegian Arctic is developing, including in terms of offshore oil and gas, but that's because they don't have sea ice to deal with, not because of climate change, but because of the Gulf Stream. Right. So the Norwegian Arctic is fundamentally different in terms of conditions, and so there is oil and gas activity because it can take place at a lower world price in that area. Russia is another actor. It does have some offshore oil in its western Arctic that benefits from the Gulf Stream and a relative absence of sea ice. But of course it has other drivers as well. Russia is exceedingly dependent on energy exports for its economy, much more so than Canada. Right. A lot of that energy is coming from the Arctic already, from onshore fields in Siberia. And there is a strong desire to develop the offshore for the future. And it certainly seems that the Russian government is prepared to facilitate that financially because of the long-term necessity of that. Right. I don't see that in Canada. I see that we have lots of energy that's further south that's certainly more economically feasible at a lower cost, and it doesn't all involve oil and gas. Right. One of the things that we should be thinking about as we deal with, of course, the crisis of climate change is whether, in fact, this is an opportune moment to perhaps introduce carbon pricing, because a low price at the gas tank means that consumers can absorb a carbon pricing mechanism more easily and get used to that mechanism, and then start to think about how we could use carbon pricing to facilitate the development of alternative energy and take advantage of the enormous opportunities for alternative energy that come with having the second largest piece of geography on the planet.
Right. So perhaps we can just conclude on that note. With all of these moving pieces in the Arctic, where do you see the future of Arctic governance going?
Well, I think we're at a moment of choice. Okay. And the choice is one that countries like Canada and the United States need to make. And that is whether we allow these serious problems with Russia in Eastern and Southern Europe to extend into the entire relationship. And that certainly seems to be the direction the current Canadian government is considering going, to treat all international relations with Russia under the same rubric. I would suggest that we should be more mature than that, and that the United States at the moment is more mature than that. And think back to the Cold War. Even at the height of the Cold War, we cooperated with Russia in the Arctic. I've already mentioned how we together negotiated the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea during the Cold War to serve both Soviet and Canadian and American interests. Another example, the 1973 Polar Bear Treaty. In the early 1970s, the polar bears were at threat of extinction because hunters were starting to use helicopters to hunt polar bears. Okay. A very effective way to hunt polar bears. Sure. Scientists from all the Arctic countries told their governments, look, this is a problem. If you care about the polar bear, this iconic species, you have to stop the use of helicopters. And the 5 Arctic Ocean countries, including the Soviet Union, got together, height of the Cold War, negotiated the Polar Bear Treaty, banned the use of helicopters in hunting polar bears. Saved the polar bear. Yes, now they're threatened by something else. They're threatened by climate change, but they're not threatened by big game hunting because we were able to work with the Russians. So we've done it before. We've separated out different areas of international affairs, and there are lots of examples of this in other areas and other parts of the world. You don't paint with a broad brush in international relations. You focus on discrete sector-by-sector self-interests and cooperate where you can.
Michael, this has been absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much for being on the show. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. Please join us again for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter.